to the 5 strands of reading, and we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about fluency. And we have defined fluency as the mastery of the skills of systematic phonics to the point of automaticity so that the student does not need to think about each word. And I think, having just done the brain science, we can see that fluency is the mastery even of those brain patterns, right? Those brain pathways becoming really fast. And the key words here are mastery and automaticity. So it takes practice to master something. And sometimes I think we have these expectations in this world that we don't need to practice to develop mastery. But when a child's learning to ride a bike, what do? They practice. And first they practice with training wheels, or now those new little scooter bikes, and then you run alongside them. But they're practicing to develop fluency until they can do this. They don't just go and get on a bike and go out mountain biking or road racing, do they? It takes practice. How about painting? I mean, it takes practice to go from here to here, right? It takes practice to learn how to fix a car. We need a lot of exposure until we're skilled at it. And that's also true with this skill of reading. We need to practice it. All skills need practice. And we now know that once students know those letter sound or phonogram sound correspondences, they can self-teach. They can self-practice fluency and develop fluency by practicing and reading to themselves. At Logic of English, we also talk a lot about helping students practice and develop mastery by having fun. I think the best practice is always fun and it's engaging, and practice always takes repetition over time. So if you think about this too, I studied chemistry in college for a number of years. I can't even tell you what organic chemistry is about other than that it's about organic compounds, but I don't remember anything about it. Why is that? I haven't used it. If I was a chemist today, would I be able to tell you what this is about? Yes. So it takes practice over time. It's normal to forget things if you take a break. And I think it's really important to understand it's normal for your students to forget things after Christmas break, after summer break, after the weekend. Or what if you only put your phonics lessons on Monday? What's going to happen if you wait a whole nother week? It's going to take a very long time to master this because without repetition over time, they forget. It takes practice, fun and engaging practice over time. And once we have practice, more practice leads to automaticity and it leads to mastery. So what are some of the skills that need to be practiced with systematic phonics to develop fluency? The first is phonograms. The students need to become fluent in the phonograms in order to have those foundational skills. They need to see an A and go a-a-ah. They need to see the phonogram and know the answer. And it's really interesting. A trainer from another program once told me this story, and it's always stuck with me. She was on an airplane, and she sat down, and as you do on an airplane, introduced herself, and this gentleman next to her asked her what she did, and she said, "Oh, I'm a literacy trainer." And he said, like, ooh, ow, off, which is a phonogram that you'll learn tomorrow, which is the only one with 6 sounds. And she was like, "Yeah, do you teach reading?" And he said, "No, I learned that in kindergarten and in 1st grade." And he was like in his 50s or 60s, and she was like, "How do you remember that?" And he said, "We practiced it every day through like 3rd grade." Well, so once you practice it over time, it sticks with you, and then these are the little pieces that you need to read and spell any word. So we should have this mastered, like our math facts, right? Like we need this information to read and spell well. But she then said, "Well, how do you have time for that?" And he said, "Oh, we could read all the phonograms in less than 2 minutes." So he said a lot of times the practice was only a minute long. We'd race ourselves, but we always practiced them. So practice happens over time. Phonogram fluency is really the foundation of this. And in foundations and in essentials, there are a lot of games. And I think practice should be fun. So there are games. And I was just hearing someone saying that many of the kids in their school are bringing the games back home and practicing them with their families even. Isn't that great that they want to play the games? And if you play the games, you're going to have kids asking, can we play this game? This is my favorite one. Can we play that one? So what are they asking you to do? They're asking you to practice phonograms, which is really great. The next kind of level of this is word fluency. You need to combine those phonograms into words. And so there's all sorts of games in foundations and in essentials to practice word level fluency. Another place that we practice word level fluency is through spelling analysis, as we've been modeling. But we can get at this in many different ways, and it takes time, right? Seeing the sounds, connecting the letters to the sounds, and then discerning their meaning to develop a really fast pathway. High-frequency words, we'll spend more time on this as well, but it is important to learn the high-frequency words, not as sight words, but to learn to read them and to practice them because they are very, very common. But both foundations and essentials has high-frequency word practice, where once you learn a phonogram and a rule to decode that high-frequency word, those words will show up in the reading games. They'll show up in spelling analysis. So you'll be practicing all those. You don't need to take your high-frequency words and teach them in addition. They are all going to come up. I saw someone wincing, and I'm going to tell a story because I think one of the things that's been most surprising to me has been the number of teachers who get really excited about this and then go back and teach sight words as high-frequency words as sight words and try to add them in addition. But you are going to get all of the high-frequency words taught through spelling analysis in foundations. They are in the level A list, and they are in the games. So your students will learn those words. They're already embedded in the curriculum, but they'll learn how and why they're read and spelled that way as well. We also need practice applying new phonograms and rules. When students learn that this says, what does this say? Ow, oh, they're going to need some practice reading words like cow, flow, flown, brown. They need practice reading these using the different sounds. And again, there's games that can do this, or that does this in foundations and essentials. Once they're reading words, they're ready to move on to phrases and begin practicing reading slightly longer text. So there's, again, all of this practice embedded in the curriculum where they build from words to phrases. Soon, they're ready for sentences. And again, there's all these activities to practice sentences. And as those pathways build, right, and as they learn enough phonograms and rules, soon they'll be able to decode at the level that they can orally comprehend, and you'll see those reading levels match their oral comprehension skills. But as they're learning the phonograms and rules, they need to build practice and fluency with these things. Then there's textual level fluency. You'll see the text get longer and longer. So there's some examples in foundations. Fred the Frog on the bottom has sentences. Then they move to longer sentences till soon they're reading whole paragraphs in multi-chapter books like Miles and Jack's and other early chapter books. But the texts get longer. Same thing happens in the Essentials Reader. The texts maybe start as 1 page, and soon they're 3, 4, 5-page long texts. So we help the students develop fluency. Prosody is also really important, reading with expression. And they have found that how well a student reads with expression is a relatively reliable indicator of how well they're comprehending the text. And that's very interesting. I think that fits with what you were saying earlier or during the brain science, that students who are reading silently are also reading with expression, or they're listening to themselves read. And expression is expressing meaning as well. So in Logic of English, there are activities where This is just one example where they practice reading questions and reading it with the inflection of in question. There'll be activities where they have to reread a text and use different voices for different characters. They'll talk about pausing, but all of that expression is also built into the lessons as they're encountering texts. Another thought for you as you think about developing fluency with your students is the concept of depths of learning. And this was something that was actually brought to me strangely by my son's piano teacher, but it made so much sense to me. And I've seen it, and I've experienced it a lot, where this concept of matching, if you hear and you match a sound through multiple choice, this is the easiest. So you hear something, you're trying to match the phonograms. You're playing that game Slap that you played yesterday. So this is the easiest level of learning. The next most difficult would be reading, where you actually have to see it and then read it. But the most difficult of all would be writing. And you've experienced this, right? And you'll experience this even as you're trying to master the phonograms. The hardest thing is going to be if I say them and you need to write the sounds. So we'll try that a little bit later. What I want to encourage you is not to do kill and drill. I feel like so much of American education is kind of turned into these boring worksheets and rote practice and something that doesn't have a lot of meaning. So, and I also think it's really sad because somehow phonics has gotten related to kill and drill, which makes no sense to me because phonics and phonetics is a topic. How you teach it could be kill and drill. You can teach anything in a really boring way that is not engaging to people. But kill and drill is boring. It lacks context. It lacks preparations. It's often just put worksheets in front of them or fill in the bubbles. It's busy work. But good, effective practice is fun. There's games. You'll see there's a lot of games in foundations and essentials. The difference between the games and foundations and essentials is the age of student that those games were written for. Foundations games, the kids will be up jumping on things and throwing balls at the whiteboard and all sorts of active sort of games. Essentials games are often more card games and games that an older student would feel good playing because if you ask them to jump on the phonograms or throw a ball at the whiteboard, they might go, "You're treating me like a baby." And we don't want to do that. We want to respect who they are and what they find to be fun. Effective practice is also meaningful. It's making connections. And you're going to find that kids, when they learn the phonograms, are going to start seeing them in their science texts. They're going to start seeing them. People are nodding. I've been in classrooms observing where they're like, "Oh, it's an AY at the end of Monday." But effective practice helps kids make those connections and engage. It's also daily, and I have a little video for you about this.
I think a lot of English results to building the student confidence is because, first of all, we start off in a safe place for them. They know they could take a risk. They know they can try. And because it's repetitive for as going over the sounds every day. And so if you didn't get it today, well, then you'll hear it again tomorrow, and you'll hear it again the next day, so that, okay, once you hear enough and you say it enough with me and go over it enough that you will develop that sound, you can hear it, and then in turn you can use it. So just that they'll get a chance to say it over and over and over. And I think that's just so important. I mean, so many other programs I've done is just to allow that time to see it every day, and you do it over. And sometimes we race against ourselves. I set the timer. I said, okay, we have 2 minutes. Let's see how many we can get done in 2 minutes. Or let's see how long we can do it in a minute and a half or in a minute, you know. So we do little things with that, too, to keep it fun and innovative so they can want to keep going over the sounds. But just that, being able to do it every day and then repeating. And then, you know, with the spelling, you say the word, you do the sounds of the word, let's write the word. It's in a sentence. So I think all that's just very important to come together.
Yeah. I think she said it well. Every day is that practice is happening, and that's how we develop mastery. And so when I hear about classrooms that are struggling, one of the things I ask them is, how often are you teaching it? And what I often find is they're not, or they're teaching it once a week or twice a week, but they're not actually teaching every day. So very, very important. Effective practice is short. It doesn't need to be long, it shouldn't be really drawn out, but it should be short. And it's consistent. And I think this is also really important in our classrooms, especially with our struggling readers and our struggling students. What they're learning in the classroom needs to be what they're learning when they're pulled out. They just need to be taught the same content with more contact or more games or another explanation, but the subject shouldn't change. It's not like 1 + 1 no longer equals 2 when you're pulled out, right? So A still says a. So it's very important that we think about our curriculum in consistent ways. Also, in so many schools, what first grade is teaching does not match up with second grade. And that's really confusing, isn't it? We're teaching different sounds. We're teaching how the language works. It's the same language. And I can't emphasize how important it is that we're consistent about how we teach. Yes, play new games, mix up how we practice, but the content should still be the same. Effective practice has variety. This is a school bringing their kids outside. They're playing hopscotch with the phonograms. And great teachers are able to get their kids moving and not skip those. Those activities are really, really important. And it's multisensory. I also want to say effective practice is really encouraging and respectful. And when it is daily, the students' self-esteems go up because they start to develop mastery. And when students develop mastery, they begin to feel better about themselves. So just being aware that that daily practice, too, is really important to them as well. Effective practice is engaging. So one last video on this for you.
I like the games in logical English because it allowed my students to actually practice what they're struggling with without having the restraint of, okay, I'm struggling with this and I don't want to. Because a lot of my kids, when you know you're struggling, they don't want to try or want to do it because they are struggling. Because when you're struggling, it's difficult for you and you don't want to do it. But the games allow them to relax, loosen up, and you're actually going over what you're struggling with, but they don't realize it or really key on it because it's a game. And we're having a good time, and it's in the group. If I don't know the sound, so I'll put it back in. But I'll pull out another card when it comes back to my turn. So it loosens them up, and then it makes it easier because it's not, oh, I don't know this, and everybody's going, no, I don't know it. I'm playing a game, and it's fun. And then you're getting a chance to actually practice what you need help on.
And I think it's really fun because we get a lot of feedback that kids, especially doing foundations, think that they're going to Dragon School. And I think they see that on the book and they just associate it with fun. But there's the video of the boy who's reading, and what's really fascinating about that is we came into their school to do some student interviews, and that little boy had been in the emergency room the night before after his baseball practice or something, and his mom didn't want him to go to school that day because they'd been in the emergency room late, and he was like, I have to go tell them because I love Logic of English, it's so fun. It was so sweet. So he came in and was telling us all of this. But I think it's important that kids identify it as fun. And as they do that, they learn and they don't even realize what they're mastering and the fluency that they're developing. Independent reading is also really important. Once they learn the phonograms and rules, having them practice by reading. When a student is not gaining fluency, I think it's really important to ask the question, what skills are they missing? Are they missing phonemic awareness skills? Are they missing some of the systematic phonics skills? Where are the underlying foundational skills that they're missing? Because oftentimes when they're reading and not reading fluently, they're missing something foundational in their understanding of reading. How do we measure fluency? That's a big question, right? In Foundations D, we began to measure words per minute. And there's a fluency recommendation from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. There has since been an updated fluency scale, which I have printed in your training manual, that gives you the 25th, the 50th, and the 75th percentiles at these various points. So if this is helpful to you, go ahead and use this. But it helps you to kind of place a child with their words per minute. Now, that said, there's questions about words per minute. because that doesn't really tell us everything. I think how a student reads is also measured very well by this. And this is also from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. In fact, this is now the fluency chart that they use. They don't use words per minute, they use more prosody. Do they read in larger, meaningful phrases or groups? Reads in 3 or 4 phrases, reads in 2-word phrases, is reading word by word. Because there's a lot of question about rate and reading. Is it really the best measure, words per minute? And let's just think about it for a moment. Go ahead and read this text to yourself. Are you reading very fast? You slowed down pretty quickly. Why did you slow down? Okay, there's unknown vocabulary, yes. Are you having some problems with the content too? What about the sentence structure? By the way, this is Walden. This is high school reading by Henry David Thoreau. Yes. So, what do strong readers do when they encounter a difficult text? They slow down. And then what are you going to need to do to understand it? You're going to need to reread. That's very, very normal. So I'm just pointing out to you that words per minute is helpful as a measure, but it's not everything. It's much more complicated. Fluency is more complicated than that. Rereading improves fluency. We do know that if you read a text and then you reread it, you'll read it more easily the second time. So that's a great activity for students. So if you were to reread this, now try rereading this to yourself, but pausing after the phrases. Does that help a little bit with the comprehension? Maybe a little bit. So even if there's not a comma, I should not obtrude my affairs so much on the notice of my readers. So if you kind of pause and take it in sections, there's some thoughts that it helps with fluency. And this is one of the reasons that they suggest grammar now. Some of the newer research is suggesting that grammar maybe should replace fluency in the 5 strands. I don't know, but they are saying that grammar helps fluency, especially with more difficult texts, because you know which words go together. And it helps with comprehending these longer sentences. What makes this text difficult? I think that the problem here is probably background knowledge. Do you know what? If you had a background in this sort of philosophy, you could probably read that pretty quickly. But if you don't, you have to slow down a lot, and you're not necessarily going to comprehend it. So keep in mind that background knowledge matters. And what's really interesting to me is that we get some feedback on fluency from Foundations D. And there's one text, I believe it's about a kind of whale, baleen whales. And so kids in many parts of the country don't know what a baleen whale is. And they slow down when they're reading this text. So when they count their words per minute are lower. Do you suppose that makes sense? And then kids who are maybe from a part of the country or who have been to the zoo or who just got into whales don't slow down as much. Why? Because of background knowledge. And that's just one example, but when a child is reading a text, they may have a lot of experience with this subject, or they may not. And this may really impact their words per minute scores. So just be aware of that. You're going to see some ups and some downs based on the background knowledge of the student as well. Fluency is the mastery of the skills of decoding and encoding to the point of automaticity, so that students do not need to think about each word. And sometimes we forget that reading and spelling are closely related skills, and in many of our schools, we're no longer teaching spelling. But it's also becoming very, very clear through the research that students who learn spelling actually read better. So all those spelling lists that many people in my generation did actually also helped our reading, even if they were memorized by rote. But spelling analysis, you can see how it helps to bridge those together. Also, it's important to think about if you can read a word, you may or may not know how to spell it, right? However, if you can spell a word, you absolutely know how to read it. So by practicing spelling, we are also developing reading fluency. Reading, spelling, and writing, they're all related. When we're practicing and when we're writing, we're actually developing reading fluency, and it is all one subject. In foundations and in essentials, there are also spelling games, and I think that this helps students to practice not only spelling, but also reading, and sometimes, again, we don't always think about that. Another way that we can help with words where there are multiple ways to spell a sound, or phonograms have multiple sounds, is with a spelling journal. And what's interesting about the spelling journal is that if this sound, like ah, has only one way to spell it, it's not in the journal, because that's easy to spell. But say the sound A, there are many ways to spell the long sound A. And it's very reasonable that a student would, say, use E-A instead of A-E in a word. And here they can then put that word in that column, and it can become their own reference for the parts of words that are tricky to spell. So this can be very useful for students learning to spell and developing spelling fluency. I'd also like to encourage you to revision your word walls. So often word walls are sight word walls. However, you can still have word walls in your room, but you can choose a phonogram, you can choose a spelling rule, and you can begin to collect words from their reading, from their writing that you encounter, from your spelling analysis, and put them up on the word wall, organized by either spelling rule or by phonogram. Our website has a free template for this as well. Again, if you can write a sentence, you know how to read it, but the inverse is not always true. But a great way to practice writing fluency is one, copy work. So just copying sentences. You'll notice that copy work comes in Foundations B. They'll copy how the handwriting looks. But by C, they're taking a text in Bookface and then writing it, because then it looks a little different. There's also copy work available in the student activity book. Another great option is dictation, where you have to take a phrase and you say the phrase to them. They have no written example of it, and then they need to write it. There's examples of dictation in both Foundations and Essentials. And this is the closest we can really get to practicing original composition, because you have to hold those thoughts in your mind as you write them. We can't give them original thoughts, but we can give them a sentence or a phrase that they need to write. So when you teach dictation, you just say the phrase or the sentence twice, and then the students repeat it out loud, and then they write it. And then they could read it back to you, and you can write it on the board, and you can talk about it. You could talk about the phonograms that are used, or the punctuation, or what's happening in that sentence. And then finally, composition. You know, composition, it takes a lot of skills, right? A lot of higher order thinking skills. And these are also all embedded in Foundations and then also in the Essentials Reader Teacher's Guide. But this composition skills build. We'll talk a little bit more about composition, but I do want to leave you with this thought, and that's this. So often we have this idea that kids can go straight to composing without learning phonograms, without learning handwriting, without learning how to write. And kids have ideas about what they want to write, so it's fine to write them down for them. It's fine if they're wanting to write ideas for them to put their ideas in writing as they want to. But I think we shouldn't force students to write who aren't ready to write when we haven't taught them the foundational skills. Does that make sense? And that's happening a lot, and I think there's a lot of confusion about that, but we'll come back to that. All right, so any thoughts about fluency? Yes?
Yes, Denise, I haven't asked this question and it's not related with fluency.
That's
but
fine.
Yes, I forgot that I had this experience in this last school where I taught. Even that the principal knew about phonograms, but because I was teaching kindergarten, and you know the most frequency words are with short and long vowels words. She told me, like, keep the last sounds for next years. So all the time I was taught, well, even that I told them, it has 3 sounds, the a, but we will use the first 2 sounds for most of our teachings, yes? Where do you, this is a question, yeah. So you recommend from the beginning to
All the sounds, yep. Well, imagine how confusing it is, right? A student, and maybe words are more controlled in your setting, but imagine how confusing it is when we say that A says a, and then they go up and they see the word water on a water bottle, and you go, oh, you'll learn that later. Or you come across the word ma. And even if they don't know the spelling rules yet, explaining some of these, you can go, oh, look, that's a, it's saying its third sound. And it reinforces that this is what's happening. And there are programs that try to introduce one sound and then the next and then the next, but I don't think that builds mastery as well as just learning them all up front. And I do think it generates confusion. Oh, that's going to be later, that's going to be later, that's going to be later. Yes?
I just had something I wanted to add to the fluency thing, because somebody had mentioned that they do some of those games at stations, and the kids really like them, and it made me think of a third grade teacher that had me come into their classroom during his station time he was implementing, and he wanted to know what stations do they really like what ones do I need, am I getting the most bang for my buck, and there's like 24 students in there, and half of them picked their Logic of English game station, and the other half picked reading. So you can see those 2 things, they were using the one to do the other, and those were the 2 that they viewed were really fun. And the other 8 stations they didn't like.
What were the other 8 stations?
There were some word work stations that weren't LOE. So some word ladders, so kind of build, but which are pretty vocabulary, pulling and removing some of those. And another ones were games too. Like little board games that were literacy based around comprehension strategies. They didn't want those. They wanted real reading and they wanted their LOE games. So it's kind of interesting.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah.
I need to just do those too.
Well, it's actually somewhat relating to me even to these pathways, right? Like if you need the phonograms to get up to the pronunciation area of your brain, which then accesses meaning, maybe students are intuiting like how important that is to them able to go to read real text. So I don't know, but it's just, it is interesting to me.